Good evening, good morning from wherever you may be joining us. My name is John Gazvinian. I'm the Executive Director of the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this latest in the series that we're doing with the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at Penn on the theme of global social change and the global Middle East for the academic year 2021-22. It's been an exciting and stimulating series, as those of you know who have been attending all of the talks. Obviously, we had hoped things would look very different when we began planning this entire series a couple of years ago. But we are hopeful that the last couple of events can still be in person. Those of you who came to our in-person keynote address at the beginning of the year with the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Tawakkol Karaman, will know and remember how nice it is to be able to gather in person, and we hope that we'll be able to do that again very, very soon. But today we are immensely fortunate to have two of the real giants in the field joining us today, Fawaz Georges and Timothy Mitchell. We are very, very excited to have them for this thematic discussion of external, external and regional relations in the Middle East. Before I introduce our speakers and our moderators today, I just want to run through a couple of housekeeping notes. I want to begin, of course, by thanking our partners in this endeavor, the Andrea Mitchell Center, its director, Jeff Green, and its associate director, Matt Roth, who have both been just incredible partners to us as we've planned all of these events, as well as, of course, our very large committee of faculty composed of faculty from Penn, as well as surrounding colleges and universities who have helped us plan this series. I also, of course, want to thank our outstanding staff at the Middle East Center, Ibrahim and Kristen, for their help as well in putting all of these events together. I want to remind you that this event is being recorded, and it is our hope to make it available after the fact, technology permitting. I also want to remind you that the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania is a federally funded Title VI National Resource Center. As such, we rely on the feedback of our attendees, as well as as part of our regular federal reporting requirements. We distribute a survey, which is going to be dropped in the link to which is going to be dropped in the chat any moment. There it is. And we would be very, very grateful to you if you take a moment to fill the survey before you leave the meeting today. We, of course, hope that you stay until the end, but if for some reason you do leave a little bit early, we would just remind you to please take a moment to fill in that survey. These are actually very, very important to us. They really help us to shape the events, but they're also critical to, as I say, our federal funding and requirements, which help us to keep these kinds of events going. So we're really grateful for your feedback today. With all of those housekeeping notes out of the way, I remind you, well, of course, one more housekeeping note. I remind you, of course, as always, as a Zoom webinar, we have Q&A function in the bottom of the screen. Please use that for your questions rather than the chat screen. And we will moderate your questions as the event goes on. And I would remind you, as always, to please feel free to begin asking questions right away. You don't have to wait till the end of the event to ask questions. In fact, we prefer it if you begin to submit your questions as the speakers and moderators are talking, as that gives us some questions ready to go when we turn to the audience Q&A. With all of that out of the way, it is my really immense pleasure to be able to welcome these two outstanding scholars and thinkers to the conversation today. I want to begin with Fawaz Georges, who is so graciously joining us all the way from London today and staying up a little bit late for us. Fawaz Georges is Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and a Professor of Contemporary Middle East Studies. He was also the inaugural director of the LSE's Middle East Center from 2010 to 2018. It would take all afternoon to list all of his publications and all of his many contributions to the field, but of course he's particularly well known for books such as Making the Arab World, Nasser Qutb and the Clash That Shaped the Middle East, which came out a couple of years ago. He has, of course, books such as ISIS, A History, which came out in 2016, Contentious Politics in the Middle East, the New Middle East, Protest and Revolution in the Arab World, Obama in the Middle East, The End of America's Moment, etc., etc. And he has a new book that is coming out very soon that we're all looking forward to from Princeton University Press, called The 100 Years War for Control of the Middle East, from Sykes-Picot to the Deal of the Century. So Fawaz Georges, we're very honored that you were able to join us today. Joining him will be the equally esteemed Timothy Mitchell, who's the William B. Ransford Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Columbia University at the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. It would similarly take me a great deal of time to run through all of his publications, but he is an expert in colonialism, political economy, the politics of energy, the making of expert knowledge. He's trained in law, history, and political theory, and works in a dynamic and interdisciplinary way. He is perhaps best known for his book, Carbon Democracy, Political Power in the Age of Oil, which came out about 10 years ago now, and has really helped to shape our understanding of the issues that we're going to be speaking about today. So we're grateful also to Tim Mitchell for joining us from New York. The conversation will be expertly handled by two members of our committee, two of our local scholars, regional scholars here in the Philadelphia area. First, we have MATTA, who is an assistant professor of sociology in the Department of Global Studies and Sociology at Drexel University, who looks at structural inequality and social change in the Middle East, focusing on gender and labor movements. She's working on a book manuscript called Class Forces in the Egyptian Uprising of 2011. And we are also going to be moderated by EILEEN Ryan, who is associate professor, of history at Temple University, who works specifically on Italian colonialism in North Africa. Her first book was called Religion as Resistance, Negotiating Authority in Italian Libya. And she has a new book that she's working on called Black Italy, that looks at the history of Blackness as a racial category and lived experience in Italy. So with all of that out of the way, I'm going to get out of the way and hand you over to the very capable hands of Neda and EILEEN, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, John, and thank you to both of our speakers for being here. We, Nada and I, decided that we would start by having the two main speakers, Fawaz and Tim, if I may, start with a few preliminary comments before we pose some questions and then open it up to all of the attendees. So I think we decided that Fawaz would go first. So whenever you're ready, please take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you, John and Jeff, for the invitation and for our moderators. And I am really delighted to be with Tim tonight because I am a great admirer of Tim on many levels. But that's not the time to talk about Tim's achievements and scholarship and what we have learned from his scholarship. Myself, as a student, I read him many years ago, and I still read him today. And my students do read Tim's critical and provocative scholarship. I think Tim and I are assigned a very broad topic. Regional and external politics. The question really is where to start, how to start. I mean, the question for me is what can regional and external politics tell us about social and political change in the Middle East, not just social change, broadly speaking? What lessons have we learned from studying regional and international politics over the 100 years. If we look at the Middle Eastern state system in the past 100 years, from 1945, more than 100 years to the present, at least to my mind, the convergence between regional politics and international politics, the dialectics, the intersection between regional politics and international politics has been a significant barrier to social and political change in the Middle East. A significant barrier from 1947, 1948 to the present. I think at the risk of simplification and even distortion, I would say there is something resembling a geostrategic curse that has inflicted our region since the end of World War II. And this, what I mean by a geostrategic curse, geostrategic rivalries, the convergence between regional rivalries and international politics that have weighed down the fragile post-colonial state and exerted considerable pressure on the state. What do I mean by the geostrategic curse? Because I don't have the time, I'm going to simplify a great deal. I think this geostrategic curse has played a major role in the maintenance of the status quo and in the blockage of social and transformative change. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about the establishment of the League of the Arab States in 1945. I'm talking about the Western defense pacts in the region in the early 1950s. I'm talking about the global Cold War from 1947 to 1989. I'm talking about the West's consistent attempts to and repeated attempts to control the regional resources and market, in particular petroleum resources. And as I've said, that this geostrategic curse has really weighed down the fragile and nascent post-colonial state from 1945 to the present in costly and exhaustive geostrategic rivalries and battles. I mean, again, we don't have the time to talk about history, but let's take the three officers who came to power in 1952. Look at their agenda when they came to power. Their agenda was development, modernization, expelling British imperial control of Egypt. Yet by the end of the 1950s, the agenda was diverted and shifted from internal development and modernization and industrialization to geostrategic rivalries in the region. And the rest is history. I don't need to remind you of what has happened to Egypt and Nasser, the Nasserist project from the late 1950s up to 1970s. We tend to look at the global Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union from 1947 to 1989 as representing a conceptual and also an ideological divide in international politics. Yet if you look at the region, if you look at our region, in fact, there was more convergence than divergence between the United States and the Soviet Union when it came to the question of change, not just social change, social and political change and transformative change. I mean, take a look at the Soviet Union when radical Arab nationalists clamped down against Marxists and socialists. What did Russian leaders do in the mid-1950s and 1960s? They turned a blind eye to the repression and suppression of the socialists and Marxists in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere. Why? Because as Russian leaders understood very well, لا صوت يعلو فوق صوت, the geostrategic rivalries and the geostrategic rivalry in particular with the United States and their own interests in the region. Again, I don't need to remind ourselves what the United States did from the late 1950s up to 1989. The United States aligned itself with the ultra-conservative far-right religious activists and states from Saudi Arabia to Pakistan to Afghanistan. It's not just the Soviet Union, but the United States itself. And this tells you a great deal how the convergence between regional politics and international politics really played a major role, not only in diverting and shifting the social struggle in the region, but in the maintenance of the status quo and the forces, the social forces, the social balance, the forces in the region. Today, I mean, look today, from 1989 today to what's happening. Think of how much ink has been spent on the fierce rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I mean, in particular, where you are in the United States, somehow Iran is demonized and Iran is made to be really an evil power, that somehow Iran is a subversive state. But yet, if you look at the rivalry between the geostrategic rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia from the lens of social and political change, again, I would argue there is more convergence than divergence between the clerics in Tehran and the clerics in Riyadh. They share a fundamental strategic goal, fundamental strategic goal to maintain the status quo and crush dissent. And I don't think I'm exaggerating. Here you have the Islamic Republic of Iran. Think of how much the Islamic Republic of Iran has invested in blood and treasure to maintain a power little nationalist Bashar al-Assad in Syria. The Islamic Republic of Iran, that has an ideological project, has fought tooth and nail to maintain Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Don't tell me that Iran really is a state that supports and backs, change, whether social and political change. Myself, I am shocked. Hezbollah, a leading resistance movement in the heart of the Arab world. Hezbollah now is fighting tooth and nail to preserve and protect the corrupt and broken order in Lebanon. And again, I'm not going to talk about Yemen. I don't need to say much about what Saudi Arabia and its allies have done in the Gulf in terms of really blocking social change and investing tens of billions of dollars in order to maintain the status quo. And also the balance of social forces in the region. This tells you a great deal that on the surface, if we look at the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, we think that the sky is falling, that somehow you have a major strategic ideological clash taking place in the Middle East. If we dive a bit deeper, we realize that there is much more convergence than divergence between Iran and Saudi Arabia when it comes to the question, the big question of change, not just social change, social and political change. Again, look at Israel now. Even Israel has got into the act of the geostrategic rivalries in the region. What's happening, people talk about normalization. This is not normalization. What you really have is that Israel is weaponizing the geostrategic rivalries in order not only to divert attention from Palestine that's taken for granted, but in fact, whether you're talking about Sudan, whether you're talking about Libya, Israel now is helping the strong man, whether you're talking about Sudanese leaders or General Haftar. Just a few days ago, the Prime Minister of Israel visited Bahrain, ironically, on the day of the anniversary of the Bahraini government crushing the social uprising in Bahrain. This tells you a great deal about this convergence between geostrategic, the geostrategic rivalries, geostrategic politics, and external politics. Not only that, think what we have been talking about since 2010, the first wave of the Arab uprising. Think of all the regional geostrategic rivalries that have been taking place in the region. Just in the past year, think of what has happened. It's shocking to me. You have realignment. Pivotal rival states are recalibrating their policies, realigning their policies in order to deal with internal upheaval and tensions at home. Turkey and Egypt, Turkey and Emirates, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, the Emirates and Turkey, the Emirates and Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iran are beginning to talk because the Saudis are anxious about the Vienna peace talks. They're very anxious about the retrenchment of American power. Again, it tells you a great deal. Instead of really talking about geostrategic rivalries in a vacuum, we need to take into account basically this kind of convergence. And of course, even Russia and the United States, when it comes to Syria now, are converging, the convergence of the interest. Why? What? Because there is no alternative. But let me look at the big picture here. Forget all these details that I have. If you look at the configuration of forces, not just on the regional level, but even on the international level. And when we talk about social change, because the theme of the conference is social change. If we look at the big picture is very grim. Why? Because there is almost near consensus now in Europe and the United States that of the need to maintain the status quo, the need to maintain the balance of power, stability, and stability. Ideational things are not important at all. In fact, American and European leaders and policymakers and think tank strategists point to Syria and Libya and Yemen as basically a precautionary tale against experimentation with any kind of social change. And the reassertion of Russian power in the past 15 years and the rise of China complicate matters. Unfortunately, neither the reassertion of Russian power nor the emergence or the rise of China will help us or will give us any kind of hope that this blockage, this kind of really convergence, basically, or there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Of course, I am simplifying a great deal. The geostrategic curse is not a destiny. The structure is not destiny. We know what happened in the Islamic Revolution. We know what happened in Iran, the Iranian Revolution in 1979. A diverse coalition of forces was able to basically, create one of the great revolution, not just in the Middle East, but even in world history. What I worry a great deal about now for the social forces, the activists, the freedom seekers in the region, they are not only facing autocrat and the strong man and authoritarian leaders, they're also facing multiple regional powers and international powers that basically block their way and prevent them really from asserting their agenda and their human rights agenda. And the big challenge when we talk about change, broadly defined, not just in terms of social change, in terms of piecemeal. I mean, some of you might say, well, look at what Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has done, permitting women to drive in Saudi Arabia. I'm sorry, I'm not talking about this. I'm not talking about really these tiny pieces. I'm talking about really the social change in terms of really historical transformative social change. What I see now in the Middle East, given the convergence of multiple forces against the very notion of change, I see a very painful, very long struggle and a long social struggle that will take probably decades in order to really produce any kind of result, which I myself hope for. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a wonderful way to open, giving us this broad historical overview of how you're thinking about this. Please, Tim, if you will give us your thoughts next.
Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Nada. Thank you to John and Jeffrey, our hosts, and the rest of the organizers. And thank you, Fawaz, for those very stimulating opening remarks. I hope what I say will actually complement that set of remarks quite well, because I'm going to shift focus much more to the present, and I'm going to think in particular about the role of a couple of key outside powers, the US and China. Just in these opening remarks, I hope the discussion and the questions will enable us to take up all the themes that were listed. But I thought I'd just, almost to clear some ground, start with that aspect of thinking about questions of geostrategic rivalries, capitalism, imperialism, and so on that were in the rubric for our conversation. And I actually begin with an incident between the US and China that happened a couple of weeks ago, and actually it didn't happen in the Middle East. It happened in the South China Sea. Some of you may have seen it on the news. Video and photographs of a F-35 fighter jet that mistimed its approach to the aircraft carrier that it was using and ended up in the sea. A photo of this, the pilot had ejected and the plane was sitting there in the sea for a few minutes, gently sinking under the waves and then to the bottom of the South China Sea. That story can help us think about something. I don't have time to go into the history of the F-35 jet. You may have seen that too in the news. It's by far the world's most expensive fighter jet. That single plane costs about $125 million. there's going to be a very expensive recovery operation. It probably fell in the sea because the restraining wire that catches a tailhook on the plane as it comes into land on the aircraft carrier didn't function. This was the first time this jet has been deployed on an aircraft carrier. And it's been a project to introduce this jet that has been plagued with cost overruns, setbacks, and many, many other issues. I'll come back to the F-35 in a moment, but I'm going to use its case to address a couple of standard ways in which questions dealing with the region's dominant imperial powers, dealing with the question of capitalism, infrastructure, economic development, some of the other terms framing our discussion, are usually talked about. The first one, and this is one I addressed extensively in my book, Carbon Democracy, that was mentioned in the introduction by John, is the notion that the US has been driven by a strategic concern to secure the supply of oil. And of course, around that notion of securing the supply of oil, there unfolded over many decades a much wider discourse of security, always at its center, the notice that there was some oil that was somehow vulnerable and under threat. And the other theme that one finds again and again is that what most motivates the US beyond that securing of oil is a second kind of security, which is the stability of its key allies in the region. That's a little, I don't so much dispute that as a thing that the US professes to do. I'm more interested there in what the actual outcome of US policy is. So let me just take those two in turn very quickly. So securing oil, as I show in that book, I think the major concern has not been to secure the supply of oil, but to at least just as often strategically sabotage it. Sabotage it because the thing that matters about oil is to maintain it in short enough supply that it can be sold at extraordinary prices, prices that not only cover the very minimal costs of production in the Middle East, but the much, much higher costs of production in other regions of the world, and in particular the United States. And the bigger threat throughout the history of oil production in the Middle East from the early in the 20th century has not been the securing of supplies, but just as much the sabotaging, limiting the ability of key countries at different times to actually produce oil that either threatened the price or was not sufficiently under the control of the United States or its allies. And you can trace that taking different forms at different points, of course, most recently, currently, in the entire sabotage of Iranian oil production that the US has been working on and off since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Earlier episodes one could go into. And that strategic sabotage of oil supply has been connected not only ensuring levels of profits, and those profits go to certain countries and not others, but of course with the rhetoric not of sabotage but of security has helped provide the basis for extraordinary levels of sales of arms to the region, which you're all, of course, enormously familiar with. But one of the things that's less often mentioned in talking about US arms sales to the region, besides its critical role in maintaining profits of a significant number of American firms, is its role in the international system of credit and banking and the profits to the financial sector from the role it can play, particularly since the 60s and 70s on today, in securing the form and the flows and the profits of international banking. So that F-35 jet that crashed because it didn't catch the wire that stopped it falling off the bow of the aircraft carrier is not just a single expensive failure. The very vulnerability of that jet and the extraordinary expense is actually illustrative, I think, of the current situation the US faces in the Middle East and in other regions where it's concerned to maintain the benefits it's had from these decades of relationships with its key allies in the Middle East. One way to put this, and I'm quoting here a recent article in, I think, Foreign Policy magazine, is that the F-35 is America's Belt and Road Initiative. And it's a useful way to think about the difference between China and China's interests and involvements in the region, and America and America's involvements in the region. The point of that article and that way of thinking about this one jet is that the F-35 is not actually a plane, or at least it's not just a plane. It's actually a program, an entire package, an extraordinarily expensive, package for arming air forces and for tying air forces of key countries into a system of American finance and control. I mean, just having to spend 100 to 125 million on a single plane is in itself a quite astonishing thing. You can buy what you need from a country, but it's very hard to find things that you can get one of your allies to purchase that wraps up in such a tiny package, such an extraordinary amount of expenditure, and again, finance and credit payments and interest and things of that sort. But what makes it a package and more than just a single fighter jet is that this jet comes with an obligatory, extraordinarily costly maintenance program that you have to pay the American manufacturer, the training of its pilots over time and the upgrading of that training. But actually much more than that, an entire program of military and political restrictions on what you can do as a state once you agree to buy into this program for the purchase of this one jet. And essentially what the US gains by enticing countries into the purchase of this jet is a control over their entire arms purchasing program, specifically the details of the agreements countries have to enter into, prevent them from purchasing arms from rival arms producers, and in particular from China and Russia. So, for example, when Turkey, having signed in and started to receive its F-35s and then turned to Russia to buy some air defense missiles, it was warned that the planes would be grounded and its entire military and relationship with the US would be at stake, because this was a violation of this contract, of this entire program. Same with Israel when it decided to buy Chinese parts for some drones, that that would void the terms of the sale of the F-35, and Israel had to back out of buying Chinese components. So this plane is able to mobilize, this one extraordinarily expensive but very tiny package is able to mobilize an entire set of financial penalties, sanctions, because the punishments for ignoring the US instructions on this would actually be to be shut out of the global financial system because of the ability of the US to control the payment system that countries depend on. You've seen the impact of that on Iran, and that's the kind of sanction with which the US backs up this, this package that this little plane carries. That's why I found it very interesting to think of the F-35 as the China's Belt and as America's equivalent to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. As I'm sure you all know, the Belt and Road Initiative is this vast program of Chinese investment, not only across the Middle East, but many other parts of South Asia, Africa, and elsewhere, that centers on the building of infrastructure for the most part, ports, high-speed railways, light railways, road networks, power plants, oil refineries, dams, industrial parks, now extending into hospitals, and of course entire cities, including the new Egyptian administrative capital. The great thing about organizing one's geostrategic power around infrastructure projects is that those projects, compared to other kinds of commercial relations, tend to be long-lived and can be organized and set up with a system of repayment that guarantees a flow of funds over years or decades. On the other hand, if a country defaults on that, as there have been some cases of, Sri Lanka is a notable one, but if, for example, the payments for the privately owned port that China is constructing in Haifa, and a second one at Ashdod, it has the sanction of being able to take control of the port or take over or take back ownership of the port, depending on the terms of the particular contract. That's a minor inconvenience. It affects those who've undertaken the venture, but compared to the kind of sanctions that the US can exercise through the package that comes with the purchase of the F-35, it's actually a very limited kind of power, and it's actually a very costly power to implement, because if you want to sanction those who are not paying for their port or their railroad or something, you've got to go in and run it and find new people and so on. So it's costly, it's time consuming, and it's focused on a very small element of one's relations. Whereas, as I already said, with the sanctions that come with the violation of a military contract, the US can deploy this extraordinary new power it has, not only in the Middle East, although that's where it's been mainly used, to block a country from the system of international payments. One of, I think, the key transformations regionally, strategically, over the last 2 to 3 decades has been this transformation in the form of sanctions. You'll remember back to the 1990s, to the US sanctions regime imposed on Iraq under Saddam. You'll remember similar sanctions regimes imposed on Iran. They were relatively easy to circumvent. They might have caused inconvenience and they might have caused extraordinary hardship for affected populations, but they were physical sanctions aimed mostly at blocking trade in goods, which is hard to do if there are neighbors who will allow them to be circumvented. And even under the current sanctions, Iran has found ways to circumvent the supply of goods. But this new power to sanction, the US has developed under the auspices of the war on terror and under the auspices also of anti-money laundering regime associated with the war on terror, is a very different kind of thing. First of all, it's entirely unilateral. The US has enough control over the system of international payments, even when they work through international bodies, that it can unilaterally destroy, remove a country's ability to make payments in international trade of any sort. It can literally sabotage the very movement of funds in and out of accounts. It's not only vastly more effective because it's not trying to physically impede the movement of goods, and it's not only much more unilateral because the US can do this on its own, even if it sometimes seeks the backing of its allies. It's almost costless. It doesn't need ships blockading ports. It doesn't need complex surveillance systems. It needs a few clicks in some tables and databases held by the US Treasury. So the F-35 may look like a fighter jet, especially as it topples off the bow of the aircraft carrier and briefly floats before sinking, but it's actually this astonishing element in the kind of way in which the US seeks to employ its power today, both to punish those states it sees as having fallen out of line, Iraq before, Iran today, but also to threaten its own allies. And this jet is being strategically sold to Turkey, Israel, the Emirates, and so on. And it is they who are under the control of this ability to sanction. One can discuss the more public forms of diplomacy that have seen interesting bits of movement over the last couple of years, and people might well want to do that, but I just wanted to bring out this underlying aspect of things. I want to very briefly mention the second point, just before drawing this to a close. The question of the US commitment to the long-term stability of its allies, of these compliant regimes, of these regimes, as Fawaz so rightly pointed out, are caught within this geostrategic curse of the region. I agree completely with the notion, excuse me, of a geostrategic curse. What interests me is perhaps a little bit more that notion of how the geostrategic is framed and what is absent from it. And the thing that is so glaringly absent from it today, or at least over the last decade or two, has been the threat of climate crisis. As you know, if you put aside pledges and look at actual implemented policies, we're still headed for 3-4 degrees of warming, and thus quite severe consequences globally. We already are living with that in the Middle East. The drought across the Fertile Crescent and across Iran is the worst in 1,000 years of history, where rainfall levels can be measured through tree ring data. The consequences of that are that we know going forward, major rivers that form the Fertile Crescent and form the enable Iran itself to have some forms of slightly less arid agriculture, are simply going to dry out, or as they already are. The Euphrates is likely to lose 75% of its water, for example, as activists on water issues in Iraq has shown, if not dry up completely. Rising sea levels, the Egyptian Delta, Iraq, rising air temperatures and the moist air temperatures, the so-called wet bulb temperatures, which we are on a course for creating conditions in the Gulf where towards the end of this century, human life will not be possible, because when the combination of temperature and moisture reaches a certain level, the body cannot survive. It no longer has the ability to sweat and therefore manage its own temperature. Now, those are the worst consequences of business as usual. And perhaps the pledges made most recently at the Glasgow conference might mitigate some of that. And but in order actually to reduce even to 50-50 the chances of avoiding those worst consequences, as I'm sure you are aware, we have to phase out the use of oil and gas almost completely within 30 years, just 3 decades. So a point in closest in time as the events of the 1990s, let's say. And to get to that, it's got to be cut in half within the next decade. That is going to have a profound effect on the region, not just in a decade and not just in 3 decades, but starting within the next 2 or 3 years, if not sooner. The oil prices have jumped right up because of all the suppressed demand created by COVID, but they're going to slide again. And the region of the Middle East, so dependent on oil revenues, both for government spending and for export income, hard currency income, is going to see the collapse of those revenues over the coming years, and not even decades before that. Now, the regimes of the region are actively seeking alternatives. The interesting things is they're almost all rentier alternatives. They're building real estate, basically, futuristic cities, tourism sites, and so on. the US, the larger point I want to make here is on the second thing, that the US has a commitment to the stability of its allies. Yes, rhetorically, and yes, immediately in helping in the suppression and the diversion of forms of popular political struggle. But in terms of the actual viability of those regimes over the next decade to two, given the role of the US in dragging its feet on the serious addressing of climate change, I don't think one can actually conclude that. Thank you.
Thank you both for these really great comments and very compelling arguments. The talks really complement each other with a focus on the sort of international economic interests in the region and the local geostrategic rivalries and how they both kind of undermine the ability of people to kind of pursue social change in the region. So this is really great. Before I ask my question, I want to encourage the audience to ask questions and to start putting the questions now in the Q&A so that we can get to them soon in our after we kind of ask the questions that we prepared. So I want to actually sort of focus on one point that has been made by both speakers and by the last comment that you made about US interest in the stability of these regimes. And so we see that really the US is wedded to supporting these autocratic regimes in the region. And you're saying, Tim, that this will have to change. It's not something that could be sustained. We saw following Sisi's coup in 2013, for example, that it seems for a short while that the US administration was not keen on the coup and had some kind of interest in power sharing with the Muslim Brotherhood. Is the US interested in a specific form, could be interested in a specific form of democratization, or its support to these to autocracies like Saudi is the norm?
Fawaz, do you want to go first?
I have the idea that the United States cares or promotes democracy is ahistorical. It really is ahistorical. Yes, the United States complains now and then about violations of human rights. The United States now and then withholds $100 to $200 million from the package, the aid package to Egypt. But at the end of the day, the United States fully supports Sisi. The United States provides Egypt with almost $1.3 billion a year. The United States is not really, I mean, I don't know, Tim, if you know, I have lost count of how many prisoners, political prisoners in Egypt. I don't know what they are, 20,000, 40,000, 60,000. Where's the United States in all of this? Once in a while, the United States makes some noises, but America's policies speak louder than words in terms of its support. And I think to come back to the big point is that both Europe and the United States have decided that stability and the balance of power are the key variables in the region. So yeah, the United States is committed to the maintenance of a Sisi regime. The United States has this agreement with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, but the United States is committed to the stability of the Saudi regime. When the Houthi group fired a few missiles and drones on the United Arab Emirates, the United States sent strategic armada in order to protect the United Arab Emirates. But I think what Tim, and I agree with the big point, I think we're focusing on tactical alliances, and instead of really focusing on the big picture, that the most existential crisis or threat that faces the Middle East is basically the ecological crisis. And this is what the United States cannot really protect the Middle East and cannot really protect its allies. The desert is creeping and creeping everywhere. Middle Eastern rulers really basically pay lip service to the climate change, and at the end of the day, it seems to me that in terms of the geostrategic landscape, I don't think we have seen any major change in the US posture, whether towards Egypt or Saudi Arabia and its allies in the region. The question is, will the United States be able to really maintain the system as it is in the next 1 or 2 or 3 decades? That's the question. And the ecological crisis really lies at the very heart of this dilemma facing the United States and Western Europe.
Yeah, I agree completely with Fawaz. I don't think I have anything really to add to that. Of course, we saw a decade-long US experiment in Iraq where it claimed that part of its motivation for a war was a program of democratization. It actually on the ground had very little interest in that. It tried to fashion some kind of ethnically or confessionally based system out of its own preconceptions about the nature of Arab politics, and it was largely a failure. And, you know, I'd say something similar in Egypt. I mean, it's reactive, and when there's popular movements and when there's there is immediate political instability, it I'm sure is looking at the best way to do that. And it might have felt at a brief moment that the Brotherhood government offered opportunities that wouldn't be available if there was a military coup, which presumably it knew something about being in the works. But I don't think any of that can be really called a commitment to democracy for the reasons exactly that Fawaz says. I mean, you know, the little hand slap of holding back for a while 10% of that 1.2 billion in arms. I mean, not in arms to the very people who are imprisoning, and a quite sickening attempt to sort of do PR through prisoners. I don't know how many of you have seen, but if you haven't seen it already, look at the video that the regime produced about Egyptian prisons, which made them look like 5-star resorts, because there was this little congressional pressure. And I don't see any serious commitment there to.
May I add one point, Nada, if you don't mind, just quickly. I think to mention the F-35 as an example of the new imperial outreach, or a new imperial vision of the United States. I think if we want to know where the United States, where the Biden administration, we're not talking about the Trump administration, if we really want to know where the Biden administration is on human rights and social change and democracy, let's read what the administration has said about the Human Rights Watch and the Amnesty report on Israel. The two reports by Human Rights Watch last year and Amnesty International just days ago, not to mention Israeli human rights, I think give us a clear view of what the administration, what the strategic vision of the administration is all about. It's not about human rights. It's not about social change. It's not about the rule of law. It's not about decency. It's about really security, and it's maintaining the status quo at all costs, even at the cost of the interests of its own allies, including Israel itself.
I think I'm going to ask the next question. Thank you. I've been thinking a lot during both of your talks about the question of development. It's clear that a lot of the kind of control of outside influence and limits on state development, on post-colonial state development, it came through efforts at development. I'm thinking of infrastructure projects in particular, the Nasser's infrastructure projects, and that failure of development, of infrastructure development, also ushered in the possibility of outside influence, I think is my understanding of it. You can please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm wondering if we can think about in a more regional, local level, is there a way in which development or infrastructure projects shape the possibility or limits of democracy or other forms of social change in the region? You know, when I'm it's something I was thinking about, Fawaz, when I was reading your book on the history of ISIS, for example, that kind of failure of governance as something that creates a sectarianism in Syria. So I'm wondering, and this kind of connects with a question that one of our attendees asked, so I'll put this in here as well. They asked, if with China becoming an emerging global power, do you think they could be useful in promoting a more stable economy and development in the region through the Belt and Road Initiative, as opposed to the United States? From my understanding, they have taken some more proactive steps to address climate change and its economic impacts compared to the United States. So I'm wondering if we only see development and infrastructure projects as this way of sort of outside interests in the region, or if it also shapes the possibilities for change.
Do you want me to come first, or
either way?
It's a great question. I can't really. To go back to the early 1950s and development, the free offices. The Aswan Dam was one of the, really critical projects for the free offices in terms of really, not only in terms of independence, but in terms of water, in terms of industrialization, and in terms of modernization. This was really quite, it was very controversial. We know it was. But for the free offices, this was really a first step in a journey to reach industrialization and modernization. And the idea was to get money and resources and loans from the United States and the World Bank. And what did the United States do in 1956? When Gamal Abdel Nasser and the free offices basically refused to join the Western defense pacts, in particular the Baghdad Pact, and join the US alliance against the Soviet Union, it was Gamal Abdel Nasser was penalized and money were withdrawn. And this is what really Tim was talking about, punitive. The idea was not just to deny Nasser the $55 million loan from the World Bank and the United States. The idea was to cripple Nasser. The idea was to basically get rid of Nasser in the same way that the United States did with Mossadegh in August 1953. In Mossadegh, it was an overt operation. In the case of Nasser and the free offices, the idea was to penalize, to cripple, to humiliate, to destroy. This tells you, and this tells you a great deal about the local concerns and interests, and how geostrategic rivalries, including the global Cold War, weighed down and diverted the resources and attention of local post-colonial leaders who basically had, it was a hopeful moment at the end of 1945. Another example quickly, in terms of project. If you really want to know what Middle Eastern leaders in terms of the big project, think of what Assisi is doing in Egypt, the mega project, the macro project, the prestige project, huge cities, everything. Why? Because the military is in charge. So the question is, I mean, this new city that's been built by China, who benefits from this particular city? Where are the resources? Who's building the city? Who's getting the billions of dollars? The Egyptian public, the poor, the lower middle class, and the middle class will continue to pay for these particular mega projects without really for quite many, many years. And finally, in terms of development, what worries me a great deal about capitalism is that how the Dubai model is creeping has really basically subverted development in the entire, not just in the Middle East, even in many of the South countries, in terms of the big cities, the huge building, the skyscrapers, and what have you. And this has contributed to the ecological crisis that we have in the Middle East and will have in the next 2 or 3 decades.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating history of those early decades of development initiatives, and obviously the story of the funding and the cancellation of the funding for the Aswan Dam is a vital part of that. In that early phase of development, as we know, these large infrastructure projects were actually absolutely at the heart of World Bank thinking and US thinking. even though the loan to Egypt was cancelled, there were similar projects that the World Bank got into, as I'm sure some of you know, in Lebanon, in Iran, in Afghanistan, usually centered on dam building and related things. And there were reasons for that. That had to do not just with the sort of grand vision that post-independence leaders were attracted by, but also the World Bank funding is a conduit for Wall Street funding. And Wall Street is interested in funding projects with a easily measurable and reliable return. And infrastructure projects are so big that they almost have to involve the state, and that helps it with the business of repayment, because the state can then be disciplined and sanctioned. As that the kinds of funding for the sorts of projects that might have done other kinds of things for development were certainly not attractive to something like the World Bank. So funding for industrialization, funding for other smaller scale initiatives were simply not there. Of course, nowadays development is hardly even the word, it's the private sector, it's about the creation of entrepreneurs and property rights, and there's been some very good critical scholarship, the work of people like Julia Yashar in the case of Egypt, exploring how that older sort of grand infrastructure-based vision of development has given way to the notion that you can just turn individuals into entrepreneurs without any thought for the larger issues of capitalism and how it works. Just to answer, to just think a little bit more about the question from the audience about sort of China today and these infrastructure projects. You know, in some ways it's interesting because it is a kind of return to the grand days of infrastructural development that the US envisaged back in the 50s and 60s. I think the difference probably is that the Chinese are much better at it because they've done so much of it, and they're perhaps a little less caught up in the way that the Suez S1 crisis illustrated in complex geostrategic ambitions, and they just get on with it in many cases. But again, it's the funding of infrastructure. It's the funding of these cities and these ports across the region, very much the Dubai model, as Fawaz says. You know, an interesting aspect, an interesting way in which the ecology of the region plays into this is that because so much of the region has a desert ecology, there is never a problem of development land. There is always land available, even if it sometimes has to be expropriated from people who thought they controlled it, but it is ripe for these grand schemes simply because one of the major costs of such things, actually appropriating the land, doesn't even have to be paid in many cases, and the extent of the land available, whether it's for building cities or you know, vast port complexes on the Red Sea or on the Egyptian coast of the Gulf of Suez or on the Saudi coast of the Red Sea, just that control by the state of vast areas of land, which I think is historically related to aspects of the ecology of the region, among other things, drives sort of profitability around those kinds of infrastructure things rather than forms of development that might actually create longer term jobs, careers, and so on.
Eileen, can I add just one footnote? I mean, it's a fascinating discussion. I mean, let's take Lebanon as a case study. The economic collapse. Lebanon has economically collapsed, economically and socially collapsed. I mean, can we really understand the economic collapse of Lebanon without understanding what happened in 1990, development, Solidarity? That if really the roots of the economic collapse in Lebanon basically goes back to 1990 and this mega Solidarity project by Al-Hariri and the Gulf states. More than $50 billion, Lebanon borrowed more than $50 billion. And most of the money, I had a student who did a dissertation with me on Solidarity. And after years of research, I mean, I was shocked myself that almost 75% of the $50 billion evaporated into basically various elites and fat cats and what have you. That is, less than 25% were invested in the infrastructure, in the developmental infrastructure post-Lebanon, the reconstruction itself. And this gives you an idea when you have these mega projects, whether in Egypt or Lebanon or other places, really, what lies behind them? I mean, between the World Bank and the various financial institutions in the West and the elite, the Western-oriented elite, and the whole idea, the developmental project, the Dubai project, that really now dominates in the region and is dominating outside the region as well.
Nada, you're muted.
Thank you for these really great comments. I was going to kind of shift a little bit to the people's abilities to resist and the limitations on that. So, and how the production of oil and oil structure really impacts as prospects for social change. And I think probably Tim would want to respond to this question because of your specific work on this. Your thesis is that oil has a particular effect on social power of workers. Could you elaborate on sort of the mechanisms of how this works, and how does the dominance of oil more generally influence other workers in other industries in these countries and the people for mobilizing for change?
Sure. Briefly, and without trying to encapsulate the argument of a whole book in a 30-second reply, but because it is explored in much greater detail in the book Carbon Democracy. You know, what I was trying to do there was think about the history of democracy as conjoined between a region like the Middle East and regions that historically were associated with the emergence of mass democracy. So as opposed to approaches to the problem of democracy in the Middle East, which sees it as trying to somehow, you know, late in the day replicate a politics of Europe and of the West, understand how from the beginning they were tied together in a common history of democracy. And the argument was based on drawing out a distinction between coal in most cases and how the kind of political vulnerabilities that went with coal for a variety of technical reasons allowed a moment of mass democracy in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century of popular mobilization on a scale that had not been seen before and really has not been seen since it becomes impossible again by the mid 20th century. And it was around a vulnerability to sources of energy. And I wanted to show how exactly the same period from the late 19th and early 20th century, there was the beginnings of an oil industry in the Middle East. Certainly if you include Baku as part of the Middle East and then other parts of the region. And it didn't give the same opportunities for reasons that have to do partly with the different way oil is produced. It needs a relatively small workforce. It's fluid, so it can be diverted if there's some kind of political obstruction put in the way. It came second, so it was being used elsewhere in the world, largely by the regions that industrialized first with coal. So there was this huge distance opened up between the workers who were involved in the production of energy and the workers or the consumers in places where it was used. So trying to think on that sort of infrastructural level about a history of democracy told through this ability to sabotage or not sabotage the production of oil. I can't go into too much more. It is an argument that oil workers in the Middle East didn't protest. They did, and the waves of strikes by oil workers and attempts to demand improvements in living conditions, the exact same thing that became the basis for mass democracy elsewhere, were the same demands being made by workers in Saudi Arabia and Iran. They helped give rise to the politics of Iran in the late 40s and early 50s that Fawaz referred to yesterday, that ended with the overthrow of the Mossadegh government. And those began with worker demands, even if they became a demand for nationalization. So that's an argument for thinking about where the points of vulnerability are in any kind of technical system, and to what extent those gives rise to opportunities for sabotage. Unfortunately, part of the sort of conclusions of the book is that power of sabotage shifted. It shifted into the hands of oil corporations that could actually use the sabotaging of supplies to increase their own profits. And part of my sort of current interest in things like sanctions is because you can rank them as that same system history of sabotage and see how the power to interrupt, to sabotage, in this case, the exchange of funds between banks in a global accounting system, lands up in some hands, is concentrated in some places, and at least open up the political question of how is the sabotaging of financial flows become a monopoly of the United States, and try and open that up as a question of democracy. So the question of democracy isn't, why have we got so many dictatorial regimes in the Arab world? It is partly that, but it's also to the extent that the ability to interrupt the way things work, to sabotage for good or for bad, where do we find that? Who's using it?
May I, Nada, just add one footnote to what has just said? I mean, to me, and Tim has written about, to me, when I look at the region from the late 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, and 1970s, what the oil revolution did was to change the balance of social forces in the Middle East massively, to change the identity of the region. Because it's not just about money from the Gulf, it's about millions of workers who traveled from the region to the Gulf countries. And they send money and resources that they brought with them back to Egypt and Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Sudan. They brought with them ideas, conservative ideas, ultra-conservative ideas. Religious activism swept the region in the 1970s, 1980s. The oil money, it was not just about, the question of democratization, which, Tim has eloquently written about. It's how the oil revolution transformed the region. People now, we talk it for granted now that somehow Islamism is the most popular ideological force in the region. It was really only in the late 1970s and 80s that religious activism became a dominant force in the region. As a result, not only because of the coming to power of Sadat, but because of the oil revolution and this intersection between money and ideas and ideology that has really transformed and shaped the very identity of the region itself, and continues to do so on multiple levels. So we have to look at, and after all, this conference is about social change, and can we really understand the lack of social change, the sabotage of social change, the blockage of social change, without understanding the role that petroleum has played in the region through American corporations and through Saudi money and resources and what have you.
That's fascinating. I know Nada and I both have questions about what you see as the future of religion and religious identities. But I want to get to a question from the audience to make sure we can answer some of those. This one comes from Esmail Esfandiari, who asks, or says rather, some observers see a retrenchment of the US from the Middle East coming. They say Israel gets closer to Arab and Persian Gulf monarchies to form a security political axis against Iran and its allies as the US footprint gradually lessens, both militarily and politically. Do you see these observations as valid? Is there a scenario under which the US will be able to gradually leave the region? If yes, do you think Israel and Arab monarchies will form an axis that can withstand Iran's power and influence? So, in other words, what do you see as the future of the US presence in the region? Do you see that as diminishing?
And do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Sorry, I was muted. I was asking you to go first.
You want me to go first? Okay. I think when I travel in the Middle East, and I travel a lot, I spend a lot of time in the Middle East. Everywhere I go, the question is, are the Americans leaving? Are the Americans disengaging? Are the Americans retrenched from the region? So the simple answer is that there is a widespread perception in the region throughout, both in the Gulf and in the Fertile Crescent and in the Maghreb, that the United States is disengaging, that the United States is retrenched, that the United States no longer activate its security umbrella in the way it did before the coming to power Barack Obama arrival at the White House. And in particular, the Americas' disengagement, as you know, began after the US-led occupation of Iraq. It's really started in 2007. It's escalated with Barack Obama, and now it's full cycle. So there is, and the Saudis are anxious. The Saudis are concerned. The Saudis believe that the Americans are no longer really committed to maintaining the same security umbrella that it was since 1945 and up till the recent years. So what you have now, I look at the relationship between Israel and some of the Arab states as a kind of an insurance policy. What you really have is more of an insurance policy that some Arab states and some Arab rulers basically would like to deepen the relationship with Israel as a kind of really, just in case that the Americans pack and leave, just in case the Americans no longer really defend our interests in the region. And that's why it seems to me, if you really dive a bit deeper into the structure of the relationship between Israel and some of the Arab states, it's all about security, security, security. Cyber attacks, technology, intelligence, drones, defense systems, and this is really it's not about normalization. When the Israeli Prime Minister visited Bahrain a few days ago, he basically left behind an officer, a senior officer, who will be in charge of coordination, strategic coordination between Bahrain and Israel. This gives you a great deal. This gives you, even though you have a huge American armada in Bahrain, the Bahrainis no longer really look at the United States in the same way that they did, before 2003, 2004. The same thing with the United Arab Emirates and, of course, the Sudanese and Morocco, and to a lesser extent, Saudi Arabia. It's all behind, as opposed to really an open relationship. So the Israeli relationship with the Arab state, it's all about security, with some, economic and trade component to it. But from the Arab side, it's all about security. It's all about Iran. It's all about helping the Arab state to maintain security, just in case that the Americans really don't come to their aid in case of a big war in the region.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add. I certainly agree. Obviously the Abraham Accords and the recent consequences of that have sort of been hailed as a turning point. I don't see it that way at all. The US, Israel, and the Gulf states have been on the same side in the first Gulf War. Well, of course, Israel was on both sides in that war, but in the Iran-Iraq war, that is, but in the second Gulf, in the 1991 war and in 2003 invasion of Iraq, so whether or not they've, whatever the level of direct bilateral relations, they've been in a de facto alliance for decades, and as part of that, of course, doing nothing about the continued occupation, dispossession of Palestinians' lands. So nothing effective. So I don't see it as kind of sea change that it's being portrayed in the media. Though I agree, there's a sort of nervousness perhaps that's been added, particularly in the period when Trump was essentially, telling them to just look after themselves, and America wasn't interested, even as and as part of the same thing, offering vastly larger packages of arms sales. So it's a certain kind of disengagement, perhaps, but one that can actually accentuate and increase the levels of arms sales and enable the US to continue to offer these military packages like the F-35 and ward off the threat of much more efficient, both military hardware, much more affordable military hardware from China and Russia, as well as the involvement of those two rivals that goes with things like arms sales.
No, Tim, if you are in Gaza or in the West Bank, you look at what's happening between Israel and some of the Arab states, and you're terrified. You're terrified because Israel now has, I mean, what Israel is trying to do on some of the Arab states is to shape the imagination of the region, is to say that the Palestinians are not really the most important question in the region, is to downplay the importance of Palestine, is to overstate the importance of the security threat that Iran poses to the region. So in this particular sense, what the Accords have done is to help Israel to really put in operation its strategic goal to try to really hammer a deadly nail in the coffin of a Palestinian state, even though a tiny Palestinian state. So in this particular sense, you're absolutely correct. Historically, if you look at it, will the Accords really make any difference in the history of the conflict in 100 years or 50 years? No, not at all. But in the meantime, I think what you have, the Palestinians have been forsaken by almost everyone. And when Israel really goes to Bahrain and United Arab Emirates and Sudan and Morocco, this changes not only the narrative, but pulls the rug from underneath the Palestinian leadership. And it really, it exacerbates the predicament of the Palestinian and the struggle of the Palestinians.
Thank you. I think we have maybe time for one more question. I know it's getting quite late across the Atlantic, but we had a couple of questions about the long-term effects of the ecological risks that Tim talked about, that I thought I'd combine into one question. One comes from Magali Larson, who asks if you could comment on the migration movement that is bound to happen as an effect of the ecological crisis. And if the EU's reactionary policies will change the situation. In other words, can the geostrategic curse continue serving as a dam to prevent some kind of flood of people? Sandy Smith-Nonini also asked if there are regimes or emergent social movements in the region taking a more long-term or proactive approach to resilience as a political project to deal with ecological crisis.
Thanks. Yeah, those are both great questions. I think the question of migration, the migration that accompanies climate crisis and the disruptions that come with that is going to be an increasingly salient point. I mean, the migration and refugees from the region have tended to be associated with wars and conflict, of course, Afghanistan, Syria, and other places. But those conflicts themselves have been very shaped by the ecological stress countries are under. So they can already be thought of as part of the of what's coming. In terms of EU policies, yes, I'm sure they're going to get more aggressive, more entrenched. That's what we've got ahead of us. And I think the question is very astute in suggesting that being able to mobilize a sort of security threat that these, you know, of terrorism, of fundamentalism or whatever that can be attached to refugees from a particular region of the world will be an increasing part of that, as well as, of course, the demonization in various ways of those migrant communities when they are in the places they end up in Europe. So that's, I don't see anything other than that continuing to be exacerbated. Are there regimes that are taking a more proactive stance? I mean, there's any number of schemes. I alluded to some of them. There's the not only all the attempts to sort of diversify away from oil, that the Vision 3030 of Mohammed bin Salman, and other examples of that most of the regimes have sort of turned towards. And some of those do involve significant aspects of renewable energy, including across North Africa and linking countries, linking the generation of solar electricity and things of that sort. So it's not a picture of nothing happening. I see the problem much more at the foot dragging the US in particular has done. It's not the only country slowing agreement on more radical measures, but it's given its key position and influence, that's been very significant. And then the way in which the crisis is going to upend the existing political order as economies come under extraordinary threat. The one also finds very important local groups attempting to raise awareness. I mentioned the threat to the very flow of water in the Euphrates. There's a very interesting Iraqi group. I think it goes by the name of Iraq Between the Rivers, Rafidain. And it's actually from their website that I found some of the most interesting writing on the nature of the crisis. So there's at that kind of level, there's no shortage of people active and involved, and I think that's important to recognize.
May I just try to answer the last question about social movements? And since, again, we're talking about social change in the global Middle East, I want to end on a hopeful note, because we have presented a very grim picture of a very grim situation indeed. I have no doubts in my mind, and probably it's a cliche, that the future belongs to the freedom seekers in the region. No doubts at all. I mean, think of how many obituaries were written in 2013 about basically the death of the large-scale social movement and social protests in the Arab world. Yet in 2018, 2019, we witnessed a very vibrant another wave in Iraq, in Algeria, and Sudan. And there are really some very hopeful signs now. Sudan it's a fascinating case where social activists are standing up and defying the military officers. Tunisia is another case. Iraq is another case. But at the end of the day, given the multiple challenges and given the convergence of geostrategic, politics, both international and regional, I think this will be a long struggle. And I hope, and I do know that many of the social movements and the activists realize this is a long struggle. This is a costly struggle. This is a painful struggle. It's really the long game. And it's not about 5 years or 10 years. This is about 20 or 30 years, if not more.
Thank you both for these great talks and answers to the questions. I'm really happy that you brought that up, Fawaz, that really there's constant attempts, in spite of all these difficulties, both the external and the local rivalries, people are pushing in spite of all the prices that they're paying. So this is a sign of hope. Jean, are you gonna?
Yes, I just want to thank everybody. Thank you, Neda and EILEEN, for hosting so skillfully this conversation, as well as, of course, our esteemed visitors, virtual visitors, Fawaz Georges and Tim Mitchell, that we it's always such a pleasure to listen to and to learn from. It's been an immensely rewarding and wide-ranging and interesting conversation. The very large number of questions we've been getting as well is a testament to the level of interest. So I want to thank all the attendees as well, those of you who have attended to the bitter end. I especially want to ask you not to disappear without taking our survey. We will drop that again in the chat if you don't have the link handy. I will remind all of you that we will have another event in person, finally, inshallah, on the 31st of March with Lisa Anderson and Noura Erakat, talking about governance. And then the final event in the series will be Banu Bargu and Murad Idris on the topic of theorizing religious violence, if I remember correctly, theorizing violence in the Middle East. I want to thank again the Andrea Mitchell Center and most of all our guests and all of you for coming. We hope to see you again very, very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.